I'm Dr. Patti Peeples with the Peeples Collaborative, and welcome to the next episode of Patti's People, sponsored by the Evidence Base. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our guest, Sarah Emond, the President and Chief Executive Officer of ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. And today, we're going to talk all forms of value assessment, health policy, and patient access. Welcome, Sarah.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Patti.
Sarah, tell us a little bit about how you got to this position in ICER.
Yeah, I like to joke that no one tells you a career in health policy is a thing if you like medicine and health and biology, which I did. So I studied it in college, thought about going to medical school, actually worked in an academic medical center doing clinical research, and then said to myself, maybe there's another way I could contribute instead of becoming an academic medical doctor, and found myself actually in a role supporting biopharmaceutical companies. So my first job in industry was as a communications consultant. I was helping write press releases and talk to the media about really cool biotech innovations, and got recruited to be in-house at one of my clients, which was a lot of fun. And I found myself at the end of my 20s really enjoying that work and wondering if there was something else about that work kind of adjacent that could be fun. And I started to realize health policy was a thing. I had done a tiny bit of it in my work in the biopharmaceutical industry, thinking about policy creation, the role of advocacy, and then ended up in a graduate program to study public policy with a concentration in health policy. And I had the good fortune of meeting ICER's founder right when I was finishing my graduate program. So I joined ICER back in 2009.
So you've spent most of your career in the translational side of pharmaceutical innovations.
And it's been such a thing I didn't know was a career. And what I found, my first job in industry they really liked was I had a science background. So I had studied biology and organic chemistry and physics. And so I had this language I could use to translate these sometimes really complicated scientific principles into something that investors could understand, that media could understand. And I had no idea that was a career. And so, yes, I've spent a big chunk of my time, and I've spent a big chunk of my time now sort of communicating what can be really wonky stuff into ways that I hope a broader audience can understand about why we do this work.
Did it surprise you that ICER decided to go with someone with your type of background rather than a more maybe traditional health economist type focus?
Well, I think I had good timing. And so the first person that Steve hired is our current chief scientific officer, Dan Ohlendorf, who's a dear friend of mine. And Dan knows epidemiology and decision science and is so perfect for that part of our work. I think what Steve was looking for at that time was someone who could think about how ICER's impact could grow. And so I do think I had a good skill set for that, the communications piece, the operations piece, the translation and sort of energizing piece of like getting people excited about caring about comparative effectiveness research. Yeah. So I do think that at that time for what he was thinking about and growing ICER, it was a good fit.
ICER was founded in 2006 as part of Harvard Medical School. It's an independent nonprofit, and it's certainly increasingly being viewed as a disruptor, both positively and in some cases negatively, in that value assessment space. Where are you planning to take ICER in the next 5 years? And are you evolving into a more global focus, or is your attention still on domestic health policy?
The second part of that question is the easier question. It's still domestic. We're a uniquely American solution to this question of value assessment and health technology assessment for our uniquely American healthcare system, while international groups that do this type of work do it as a function of the government, because the government is the payer of all healthcare. And so that's more of the structure that happens internationally. So our focus is domestic. In terms of where we're headed, a part of it is continuing to emphasize the importance of an independent look at comparative clinical effectiveness and comparative value, especially for pharmaceutical products around the time of FDA approval. That's not changing. Mm-hmm. What I do want to continue to emphasize and maybe build more capacity around is the ability of the ultimate decision makers to know how to use that information for more affordable access for patients. So that might mean more collaborations with purchasers and employers who are ultimately the payer of a lot of our healthcare, right? 178 million of us get our health insurance from our employer. How are they using that that energy, that power to try to fix the system so that we have more affordable access? But that also means continuing to engage with and bringing along the drug makers, the payers, the pharmacy benefit managers, the other key parts of this ecosystem who also have a role to play in de-escalating this arms race. So over the next 5 years, I hope to continue our engagement with the purchaser community. I know that we'll continue to focus on the consequential decisions about price and access for pharmaceuticals, and we'll continue to look for opportunities for our expertise to contribute to a conversation about having a more sustainable healthcare system.
So you specifically mentioned employers and to help them know how to use this information. Break that down in terms of what that looks like proactively and tactically.
You know what? It depends is the answer, because employers are so diverse in both their perspective, their number of covered employees, their ability to engage in some of these issues. But if I'm thinking about some of the large employers who have dedicated teams thinking about benefits, thinking about costs, I do think there's an opportunity for more education. Look, there's this independent group out there producing freely available information about how we can pay for drugs so that we're paying what matches the benefit patients receive. Is that valuable to an employer going through an RFP for a new PBM? It might be. How can they be pushing their PBM to incorporate ICER's research to make sure that we're getting more affordable access? How are they thinking about where their spend is increasing most and how independent analysis of fair pricing can help address that spend? We hear from small businesses and big businesses that 15, 20% premium increases year over year is no longer sustainable. That's coming from wages. It's coming from investment in manufacturing plants. I think that it's a moment where there are employers who are ready to be more active in thinking about their healthcare spend.
How are you going to initiate that conversation with them? How are you going to help educate them? Where do you reach them?
So I go to a lot of conferences where these employers go. That's one way where I'm starting to make some connections. The National Alliance of Healthcare Purchaser Coalitions is a great venue for some of this conversation. The Purchaser Business Group on Health, the National Business Group on Health. I think there are a lot of places where employers are starting to gather to have this conversation. So I've been really fortunate to be able to be in the room with some of these employers. Some of it is venues like yours, Patti. Like, I would like anyone out there listening who's interested from an employer perspective and understanding more how value assessment can help them with reaching the grand bargain of fair price and fair access to reach out to us. I have been warned this is hard, and it's not, and I agree, just in terms of how employers think about prioritizing these issues when there are so many other challenges facing employers right now. I get that sometimes addressing healthcare costs is not your number one concern, but I'm pretty hard to dissuade from trying hard things. So I'd like to, and like the team here at ICER, same, I'd like to continue to explore whether there's a there. I'm also okay with learning that's not where the change is going to come from. And we need other policy opportunities to get to a more sustainable healthcare system. I'm open to that. But this is one that I'm excited to explore.
All right, folks, you heard Sarah. If you're engaged at the intersection of employers and healthcare decisions, reach out.
Please do.
While your focus is predominantly domestic and will continue to be so, you have initiated a triad, a collaborative triad with NICE and Canada's Drug Agency, and specifically the HEMA, Health Economics Methods Advisory Group.
Yeah.
And the mission, as I can tell, is to assess newly proposed benefits and determine that strength of inclusion of the studies that support the HTA decisions. What is the overarching purpose of this international collaboration?
Why we decided to convene HEMA was that we, as methodologists ourselves, understand that new methods are developed on how to do the work of value assessment and health technology assessment all the time. And what we need is a principled way of evaluating the new approaches to see what's ready for prime time for decision-making in an HTA setting, a health technology assessment setting. With all of the research that's out there about how to do this, whether it's the ISPOR value flower or generalized cost effectiveness analysis, we deserve to know what makes sense from a population health perspective to consider in an HTA. And I think it's fair to say that both NICE in the UK and CDA in Canada feel similarly, that there are these new methods that get proposed and talk about. So can we have a principled approach to evaluating these new methods to see which are ready for prime time? So that's really the point of HEMA, is to try to, and again, we're doing this through independent academics. So academic groups will be assessing these proposed methods, saying what the pros and cons of implementation are, and then make a public white paper. What we hope will happen then is that each HTA agency, and this can be any other HTA agency, not just the three involved in HEMA, can then know whether or not it works for their system. Because it will be different depending on the system. What NICE considers ready for prime time might be different than what CDA does and might be different than what we do. We are thrilled to have launched this collaborative. We are so excited about the members of our steering committee, the members of the working group. It's multi-stakeholder, it's multi-country. I have high hopes for how HEMA is going to contribute to a conversation about where methods are going for HTA.
When will something be available for us to review?
By the end of the year is my understanding. The first white paper should be out.
Whenever we lead an organization, I think as thoughtful leaders, we know that we have our own blind spots. We have our own personal blind spots, and the organization itself as an entity has its own blind spots. When you took over ICER, what were the blind spots that you noticed, if any, and what are you doing about that?
Well, one of them is one we identified a few years ago. So it doesn't really coincide with me taking over as president and CEO, but it's one that we continue to actively address. We realized when we started doing our multi-stakeholder engagement around our new drug reviews, we weren't doing a very good job on the patient engagement side. And this dates back now probably about a decade. And it took some difficult feedback for us to realize what an opportunity we were missing by not proactively and constructively engaging the patient community. And so we worked really hard to change that. And that is something that we continue to work on. And I'm so proud of the progress that we've done and the work that Kat Kula-Fisher, our director of patient engagement, leads. But that was a blind spot. And we are happy that we continue to think about addressing that. I think the other blind spot that's inherent in work like ours is that you can't just produce the work and expect everyone to use it, right? And I think this is true of a lot of us in certain avenues or certain places where we're like, well, this is great work. This makes a ton of sense. We should just do this. No, it actually takes implementation support to do this, talking to different stakeholders, producing different deliverables out of one work. And that's something we've experimented with over time. Our reports used to be a couple of 100 pages long. Now they're down to under 50. Now there's a report at a glance and a patient-friendly summary. All of these other deliverables help advance the mission of getting our work into the hands of decision makers and helping make more informed decisions. So I think that that's another area where a lot of us can have a blind spot that, well, if we just do good work and we put it out there, it's going to change the world, right? And so, no, it's an active process of thinking about how your work is used, talking to the people who might use it, and then back to HEMA, thinking about how you have to change your methods to evolve for this moment. And so it never ends. That cycle is continuous. So I always want us to be aware of the blind spot we might have where we kind of fall in love with our own work and think that it's just going to implement itself, so to speak.
Well, I think that that is a challenge that is not just one that's discussed in the halls of ICER, but it's being widely discussed in ISPOR as the association that represents our industry,
right,
and in virtually every HEOR department in the pharmaceutical companies. So it's really a pivotal and important question that we have to grapple with. If you look at all of the work that's been done, give me an example of some of your work that you think has really, really made a difference, and what's some work that should have made a difference that didn't?
Oh, what a great question. I think on the work that's made a difference, there's a few examples of things that we uncovered through our process that might not have had anything to do with the drug that we were studying that actually led to policy change. And so those tend to be kind of interesting moments. One was a review that we had done on sickle cell therapies. Our first review, we had noted from learning from the patient community and our conversations with the patient community, how many patients with sickle cell in the middle of an incredibly painful vaso-occlusive crisis would go and change into professional looking clothes before they went to the emergency room. And this was in the hopes that they would be taken seriously and not automatically be considered drug seeking for their pain. And we were, as a team, incredibly moved by this and put it into our report. It had nothing to do with the comparative effectiveness of the new therapies that we were evaluating. But we commit to talking about health equity with every report we did. And we heard subsequently that a payer changed their utilization management for patients with sickle cell in terms of accessing pain meds, because they thought that was one thing they could do to make it easier after reading that story. And so sometimes just the act of engaging with the patient groups, hearing from the clinical experts, having a public conversation about a particular disease area can lead to someone going, oh, maybe that doesn't make sense. Maybe that policy could be changed. So that's an example I point to of even when it's not about the fair price, fair access paradigm, there can be impact. One of the successes I love to talk about, even though it's been a while now, was when we did our first review of Dupixent for atopic dermatitis. And we were working closely with the team at Regeneron and Sanofi, looking at the data. They were giving us feedback on how we were building the model. They were not shy about their feedback. We loved it. We were having a back and forth. And we were, I don't want to say surprised, but we found it very interesting that at the end of the review, when ICER came up with its determination of fair price, the CEO of Regeneron told the world, I picked the ICER price. And now, hey, payers, you got to do your part and make sure there's not crazy utilization management getting in the way of access for patients and not crazy cost sharing. And at the time, I think that's what happened, because I think people recognize that they had the ability to charge a lot more, and analysts thought they would, but they priced it in line with value to talk about the grand bargain. I want that example more, because I do think one of the ways out of this is more of that sort of voluntary participation in the grand bargain, as opposed to what might be onerous federal regulation or price negotiation that might not think about value. You want a system where pricing to value means better access for patients. And so that's one of the ones.
In that example, did the payers respond as the exacerbated?
That's my understanding. I can't speak to the dynamics now because we've had a lot more entrance into atopic dermatitis. But at the time, it was the first disease-modifying therapy besides creams and some older medicines. And that was my understanding, is that was what the community responded with, which was better access for patients.
Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Washington, D.C. With CMS now negotiating drug prices under the IRA, how is ICER positioning itself either as a background resource, a policy partner, an independent watchdog? What role are you playing?
Probably the third one is more the better categorization of what we're doing. When we read the authorizing legislation and the guidance, we said to ourselves, gosh, a lot of this looks an awful lot like what we do every day, looking at the evidence, understanding therapeutic advance, talking to patients, understanding unmet need, and then thinking about a price that matches value. So what we decided to do with the first round was, well, first we had to guess which drugs would be on the list, because it takes us longer than a month to do a report. And so we had pretty good confidence that Xarelto and Eliquis were going to make the list. And so we did what we call a special assessment, following the statutory guidance, putting that all together into something that we could submit as part of public comment. It wasn't something we were asked to do. We are gratified to now see that it was cited as a source, because we do know what sources CMS looked at in its first round of negotiation. Those were published earlier. And so we are hopeful that they found it helpful as an input into their negotiation, because we do believe there's a role for a value assessment approach in negotiation. So we decided to do it again. So we just recently submitted another special assessment, this time for 2 inhalers that are on the list for managing COPD, Breo Ellipta and Trelegy Ellipta. And again, we hope that CMS finds it as a helpful input into its negotiations. I think that's what we can expect. Each year, there's the opportunity for us to identify a drug or two where our expertise and analysis can be helpful in contributing, again, just to the public comment period for CMS. But we're watching closely to see how this administration approaches negotiation and what we might also contribute, maybe beyond that, depending on how and what this administration prioritizes.
And what if it's not going as you wish? What if they're not paying attention? What's your war game scenario of how to get the attention where it ought to be?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I'm so interested in convincing CMS that they should, look to ICER to be the one to help them do negotiation. If they make a political or policy decision to take a different approach, like reference pricing or considering like generic pricing, you don't really need a value assessment for that. And that's okay. We have plenty of reviews that we can do of drugs in the pipeline and continue to do that. And so we'll watch for signals about how this administration views a contribution like that. And if they take a different tact, that's cool. We got other work we can do for sure.
What kind of activities do you get requested to be involved in that you aren't right now?
One where I hope there's an opportunity here for us to do something is we hear from companies, usually very early stage, who say, hey, can you give us some advice on how we should design our clinical trial program so that we have the best chance of demonstrating value when we get approved? And I want to say yes to that. I think that is such an interesting opportunity for us to really change the evidence ecosystem that we have. Because I will tell you, just as a quick tangent, one of the most upsetting things that we experience is when we go through a review and we're working with patient groups and they say, Sarah, the outcomes that I care about are nowhere in this clinical trial.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't it in your model? And I was like, because it wasn't in the clinical trial and I don't have any data, so we can't put it in the model. That disconnect, I know there's been a lot of important work with patient-focused drug development, and that there are a lot of wonderful examples in industry of taking this more seriously. But when I get a request from an early stage company that says, how can I demonstrate the best value? I think we have something to tell them, whether it's how to make sure that outcomes that matter to patients that are involved, how to make sure you're adequately capturing changes in quality of life, changes that really matter to patients. How are you thinking about your endpoints in a way that is going to help ultimate decision makers know where this sits in the place of therapy? That's a request I get a lot that I typically have to say no to for capacity reasons, but that we want to figure out how we could contribute. This is known in the health technology assessment space as early scientific advice. So that is something that I am keeping an eye on and that we would like to be able to do.
So there's no internal rub with not being able to provide that because it's not consistent with mission. Right now, it's simply a strategic priority.
I think that I think it's a mission adjacent initiative that I would like to figure out a way to incorporate. But as anyone who runs a small organization knows, you're making choices about opportunity cost all of the time with the resources that you have. And so while our focus remains on the comparative effectiveness reviews that we do, as well as our new launch price and access report, we will be actively looking for opportunities to expand our capacity so that early scientific advice might be something we can offer.
Mm-hmm. You often have to balance your scientific rigor with the public trust, and through the public trust is gained through exceptional transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Is this ever a challenge where you are seeking to achieve the greatest possible transparency with all of your stakeholders without paralyzing the decision-making process?
Sure. But I do think that we're pretty good at striking that balance. And so we've built into our process opportunities for comment from stakeholders at critical times. When we post the draft research scope, when we post the draft review, patients and manufacturers have an opportunity to pressure test the model before it's finalized. And then we have that public meeting where we can hear all of the different perspectives. I think there is the opportunity to over-index on public comment periods and stakeholder engagement so that you can actually get to an actionable report that's timely. But I do think we strike that balance pretty well. Mm-hmm. I will say that in terms of our commitment to transparency, one thing we're trying to navigate, and feedback on this is always welcome, is that sometimes the manufacturer has data that they would like to give us so that it can be part of our analysis, either in the model or as part of the comparative clinical effectiveness, but they haven't published it yet. And they don't want to risk not being able to publish it later. Mm-hmm. And so what we designed was an academic, or basically an information and confidence policy. So academic data and confidence, so that we can take that data, use it in our report, we'll redact it for 18 months to give them time to publish it so that we're not scooping the publication, and then we'll unredact it. Mm-hmm. Totally get that this might feel unsatisfying to some who want to be able to see those data, but this is one way we're trying to balance that tension between full transparency, but also having the best available data as part of our analysis.
Are the manufacturers taking up that opportunity?
They are. Mm-hmm. We have a public meeting coming up that they took advantage of that. I don't have a percentage for you, but more than 5% of the time and less than 90% of the time. I mean, there is a fair amount of uptake of this. I also think it's just the timing, it lends itself to being an option, given that as drugs are nearing their FDA approval date, that is when a lot of the researchers are putting the final touches on that phase 3 publication. And so it makes sense that this comes up, and we are really appreciative of the companies that participate so that we have the best data in front of us to do the analysis.
How is ICER using AI?
Very little right now, but actively thinking about ways that it can supplement some of the parts of our process that actually might be really good to be automated. And so for those who know, a systematic literature review, you tend to have a step where you screen the abstract of a study that's been identified from your literature search. And you screen that abstract looking for particular keywords and outcomes to see if it meets your inclusion criteria. And we do that with 2 people right now. One person does it, and then a second person does it. Could AI do the first screen and then a human does the second one? Maybe. So we're very carefully evaluating opportunities to use that type of approach to help improve or streamline, I should say, some of our work. But I can tell you that fundamentally, value assessment and health technology assessment is an ethical exercise. I do not see a future where AI is replacing the work that we do or the work that other important groups do to answer these questions, because it's very human exercise. So that's going to be on our radar, as we're not looking for AI to do all of this. But are there opportunities to introduce it into our workflow in order to improve work-life balance and capacity? Absolutely. So we're keeping an eye on that.
Is there anything over the 19 years of ICER's history where the ethics of the decision have changed?
Not the underlying principle. So the underlying principle has always been that we can make choices in our healthcare system to have prices aligned with the benefits that patients receive and have fair access for those therapies so that we can have a sustainable healthcare system for everyone. I think a lot about opportunity costs. I think a lot about what we can't pay for in our healthcare system when we overpay for certain things in our healthcare system. And I think a lot about who ends up getting most harmed by that. And it tends to be those who have been historically disadvantaged by our healthcare system already. And if you keep that as your North Star, the ethics of how you approach this work don't really shift. I am always thinking about the patient, not in the room. And how are we making choices to protect that patient while ensuring that the patient in the room can get affordable access to what they need? So I don't think the ethics have changed.
Let's go now to our lightning round, shall we?
Yes.
So this lightning round is questions that we're seeking a short answer from you. What keeps you up at night?
Right now, what's keeping me up at night is what I see as a dangerous shift away from caring about evidence-driving policymaking. That's where I'm losing sleep right now. I want to make sure we remain a country that thinks very deeply about how evidence should be informing policy choices.
What's driving it that you see that's giving that that concern to you?
I'm just worried that the ecosystem that we've developed to produce evidence has been facing some headwinds since January in terms of funding of NIH, funding of academic research. That's an incredibly important first step for developing an evidence base that helps us know that we're making informed choices when it ultimately comes to policy.
What are you highly optimistic about?
I'm highly optimistic about people who care deeply about these issues. The people who choose to participate in an ICER meeting, the people who choose to work at ICER, the people who choose to do really hard things like be at a purchaser trying to figure out how to provide the most healthcare for the most people. The people at pharmaceutical companies devoting their entire careers to coming up with disease-modifying therapies for things that have never had any hope of having an effective therapy. I see a lot of hope in the choices that people are making to do good things for their neighbors. That gives me hope.
As people in organizations, we learn from our missteps. Has ICER made any missteps that you have looked at and said, you know what, if I could do it again, I'd do differently?
I'll say one of the mistakes that I made goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I underestimated the power of patients and patient advocates to participate in this kind of exercise. That was a real education for me that I would do differently if I had a magic wand, but that I'm also really proud to have gone through for how it's improved the way I hope that I approach those types of conversations and interactions now.
Mm-hmm. And if we are honored enough to have this conversation again in 5 years, what are we going to be talking about?
Ooh, in 5 years, I think we're going to be talking about what a great job we did as a country figuring out how to expand access to two categories that also keep me up at night: obesity medicines and cell and gene therapy. Mm-hmm. There are so many people working on that right now, trying really hard to think about the affordable access for both of those. I think we're going to be proud ourselves in 5 years that we have broad, affordable access to those categories for patients.
Mm-hmm. And my last question is a fun one. What are you binge watching?
Oh my God, I cannot get enough of The Pit. I am so worried about all of the people, and I can't wait for the next episode, and I hope everyone's okay. I mean, they're doing a fantastic job, and I cannot wait for the next episode. I am currently, yes, binging The Pit.
Which is tonight.
Yes!
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. This was really illuminating, and I'm quite moved by your what I think is your authenticity of the human component in this very policy-driven work that you do. And so I want to thank you for sharing your perspectives, your hopes, your concerns with our audience. Thank you.
I really appreciate that, Patti. It has been an absolute pleasure to spend this time with you. Thank you.
Thank you.